Buddhism is 2,600 years old. It is a religion, it is a philosophy, and it is also a spiritual practice. The complexity as Buddhism moved from, India to China, throughout Southeast Asia to Europe and to America. In every one of those journeys of Buddhism, it produces not a different vision, but something that's clothed in a way in the cultures in which it finds itself.
I want to welcome everybody to the Hawaii Book and Music Festival and the Better Tomorrow Speakers series. Today we're going to be talking about Buddhism, writing, and race with one of the country's most celebrated authors, Charles Johnson. He has received some of the nation's highest literary honors, the National Book Award for his Middle Passages, perhaps his most famous work, a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, a Writers Guild Award, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Award from the National Black Writers Conference. He is also a lifelong student and practitioner of Buddhism, and his new book with Stephen Barnes is called The Eightfold Path. Can't get more Buddhist than that. And it will interweave Buddhist teachings with Afrofuturism. We're honored to have him join us. Aloha and welcome, Charles.
Thank you for having me.
So Charles, let's start with the future and then work our way back to your past. Your next book is going to be a graphic novel with a very Buddhist title, The Eightfold Path. Would you first of all explain what Afrofuturism is and how you envision Buddhism's relationship to it?
Okay, let me say a couple of things before I address that. I co-authored this book with my friend, Stephen Barnes, who is a very prominent science fiction and fantasy writer. He must have 30 books published by now. And we collaborated on this, but for me, it's really Steve Barnes's book. He's extremely prolific and creative. And this book is being published by an imprint called Megascope, which is devoted to graphic novels by and about people of color, Black people. So Steve Barnes conceived the ideas for the book, provided the characters, and he also provided the plots. And he's very much influenced by the old EC comics, horror comics of the 1950s. So these are kind of like horror stories that Steve has conceived. Now, what he wanted from me was to provide a Buddhist kind of foundation or framework for the stories. I contributed to the graphic novel an essay explaining what the Eightfold Path has traditionally meant to Buddhist practitioners. And while he provided the meat and the potatoes, right, the characters, the story idea, and the plot, I provided the seasoning. That is to say, I sprinkled philosophical ideas, and particularly Buddhist ideas, in the text. So no one is going to learn, in my opinion, what the Eightfold Path is, except in a negative way. You're going to see in the stories what you should not do if you are following, the Eightfold Path. You're going to see greed. You're going to see hatred. You're going to see ignorance. But the characters all come to a revelation by the end of the story that is compatible with a Buddhist message.
So basically, though, because I think probably a lot of people don't know, what is Afrofuturism?
Afrofuturism is something that Steve Barnes and his companion, sci-fi writer Tanana Reeve have been involved with for quite some time. If you want to understand Afrofuturism, think of the meaning of Eurocentrism. What is Eurocentrism? It is an approach that puts people of European descent, right, first and foremost, at the center of all of our discussions and so forth. Afrocentrism, by contrast, simply does that with people of the African diaspora, right? It puts them, their culture, their history front and center in stories and any other form of media.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have been a serious student and practitioner of Buddhism ever since your first experience of meditation at the young age of 14. And you've explored the many Buddhisms that have developed in many times and places. You're even studying Sanskrit right now. How would you locate yourself in this broad spectrum of teachings, practices, denominations? On which branch or branches of the Bodhi tree do you sit?
Well, you're right. The Bodhi tree has many branches. We could also call it the Buddha verse, as one of my friends, Lama Rangdrol, often calls it. Buddhism is 2,600 years old. It is a religion, it is a philosophy, and it is also a spiritual practice. The complexity as Buddhism moved from, India to China, throughout Southeast Asia to Europe and to America. In every one of those journeys of Buddhism, it produces not a different vision, but something that's clothed in a way in the cultures in which it finds itself. Now, I've studied any number of, approaches to Buddhism, but in 2007, I took my vows in the Soto Zen tradition with mendicant monk Claude Anshin Thomas. And those vows are the precepts, the 10 precepts, the first 5 of which I believe are shared by all Buddhist traditions and schools. And you know what they are: no killing, no stealing, no lying, no sexual misconduct, no getting drunk or drinking to intoxication. Those are pretty common across the Buddhaverse. And then there's 5 more vows that I took in addition to that.
Okay, so it's a fairly a position, it sounds to me like, that you're staking in terms of what might be called common ground between different Buddhist traditions, so that it's not, even though you're ordained in the Soto Zen tradition, that's not your primary identifier, that you see yourself much more broadly, it seems to me, in terms of the Buddhist tradition. Now, you also said that Buddhism goes to different places and it encloses itself in different cultures. And in this broad spectrum of the many Buddhisms, we find different traditions, and we identify them largely through racial or ethnic labels. So we say Japanese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, American or white Buddhism, and so on. In your book, Taming the Ox, you caution against using essentialist racial and Buddhist identities, such that, and here I'm quoting you, Black Soka Gakkai Buddhists do not need a Lotus Sutra written in Black English. Now, currently, there's a very interesting movement or discussion that's been going on amongst some younger Asian Americans who are trying to define an Asian American Buddhism that lies somewhere between white American Buddhism and traditional immigrant Buddhism of their parents and grandparents. It's interracial in scope, but it's still limited to Asians in America, I should say. One writer asserts that, from this group, young writer, says that to be Buddhist is to be Asian is to be Buddhist. And I find that a little bit restrictive. Do you think that maybe we're at a time where we might be able to abandon race and ethnicity as a means of categorizing and defining Buddhists? And if so, what would be a good label?
Well, I'm allergic sometimes to labels because they're like little boxes that we put people in that restrict them. My position, as I think you've seen from some of the writings that I've done, is that I think race is a lived illusion, and it has caused much suffering. in the last 2,000 years and even in longer than that. So I'm a little cautious about the idea that we should racialize Buddhism. I don't think that's correct. I think that what we find in the Buddha Dharma, right, in the teachings, is a universal message. Now, again, as you point out, when Buddhism goes to different countries, whether it's Japan, it's China, America, it will adopt the clothing, so to speak, the outer trappings of that culture to speak to that culture's people. But there's certain things about Buddhism that do not change across the Buddhaverse. One, according to the Dalai Lama, and I believe he's right, is you must accept the Four Noble Truths. You must accept, if you don't do that, the Four Noble Truths, you're not a Buddhist. And in the Four Noble Truths, the last one is the Eightfold Path. And you have to accept that as well. Buddhism has generated many libraries of commentary, on the original teachings of the Buddha. But one of the stories I like the most is the Buddha is walking with his disciples in the forest. And he picks up a handful of leaves, right? And he says to one of his disciples, "How many leaves do you think are on the trees here in the forest?" And the disciple says, "Countless leaves." Countless leaves. Then the Buddha holds up his hand with the leaves he has scooped off of the forest floor. And he says, "How many do you think are here?" And obviously, it's a small number of leaves. And the Buddha said, "That is the number of my teachings. That is the number. They are small, but they are essential, universal. They are coherent. They all refer to each other. Every branch in the Eightfold Path refers to something else in the Eightfold Path, whether it's mindfulness, right mindfulness, or it's right livelihood, or it's right speech, or right action, or right concentration. They all interconnect in a vision, a practice, and a way of life that has nothing to do with race."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you know, in some of the early Buddhist texts, the Buddha talks almost in a very way that we would think of as being modern, and that is, he talks about species, that there are many species of animals, many species of plants, but there's only one species of human beings. And that really sort of sits in with how we think of race now as a social construct, and not as something that's sort of inbred in our biological makeup.
I'm very glad you said that.
Yeah, so for a long time, the Buddhist teaching, at least the early Buddhist teaching, has been one which has tried to free the teaching from race. And that, of course, was the basis upon which the Buddha could also argue against the caste system, which was a reality in his life, So, the core of Buddhism would seem to be free of any restriction of race. And yet we continue to put it into as you put it, the clothing of different cultures and the clothing of different ethnicities, and so we still talk about today Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, and so on. So how can we get away from that?
How do we get away from that? I think through our practice, through our daily practice, and that's what Buddha Dharma is. It is a daily practice in which we move away from the dualism that is implicit in them versus us, and I versus thou, because you and I are connected in so many different ways, regardless of what the accident of our birth. Whether you were born in Hawaii or I was born in, Illinois in America, we are still human beings with very common needs. We all suffer. We all experience hunger. As the Buddha discovered when he left his father's home for the first time and he saw the four signs, we all will experience old age, we will experience sickness, we will experience death, regardless of where we are on this planet. But then he saw a fourth sign, and that was a spiritual man, a holy man. And he seemed to have a very level-headed equanimity towards these forms of suffering. And that is when the Buddha said, he's the one I'm going to follow. He seems to have an answer. And so the Buddha spent 6 years as an ascetic, because that was the Hindu tradition, starving himself and punishing his body and realizing after 6 years, this was not the best way to go. In his father's home, there had been an overindulgence of the senses, right? All the best food that you could have, all the pleasures you could have. But then he goes out and he sees the four signs and he says, no, all of this is impermanent. None of this will last. I have to find a truth that I can follow. But then when he's an ascetic, he does the opposite. He punishes the body, the senses. He tries to close off those gates of the senses. During that time, what he realizes is the middle way. The middle way. Not the extremes of sensualism, not the extremes of asceticism. That was a learning. He almost died. He almost punished himself to the point of death during those 6 years. But at the end, when he sat under the Bodhi tree, he experienced awakening through, I think it was 3 watches of the night. 3 watches of the night, one of which, during which the god Mara tried to tempt him away from, awakening. But by the dawn, he had awakened. He had overcome. The line I love is ahum kara. Ahum kara is Sanskrit. Ahum is I, kara is maker. And that night under the Bodhi tree, what did the Buddha say? At last I have found and defeated you. Ahum kara, I maker.
Along the lines of what we've been talking about in terms of this kind of liberating view, which the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree, and which has been the message passed down for, as you say, over these 2,600 years. That's a long time. There are a lot of dead religions in history, and there's a certain way in which the market determines which ones survive. And so obviously there has been something valuable in the Buddhist message that people in many places, many different times have embraced. And therefore we still have this tradition, which is still vibrant even in our own time. And it's liberating, as you so eloquently write about in so many different ways in your fiction and your nonfiction, about the way in which Buddhism is free from the usual restrictions of society, and as we've been talking about, of race. Now, you've written about Jean Toomer, the philosopher and novelist who is credited with having started the Harlem Renaissance with his novel Cain. And he described himself as someone who did not belong to a particular race, but was preparing for a new race, a new man of America, whom he called the Blue Man. What did he mean? Because it does relate to what we're talking about in terms of Buddhism and its freedom from any kind of racial restriction. But what did Jean Toomer mean when he was talking about this new blue man for a new America?
Yeah, that's a beautiful phrase from a beautiful poem of his. And you're right, his novel Cain inaugurated the Harlem Renaissance in 1923. Now, it's important to remember, I think, that Toomer was a student of Goethe. And Goethe philosophy draws now and then on some Eastern ideas, Eastern philosophies, whether we're talking about, Hinduism or Buddhism. So I think there was inclination in Toomer to look beyond the surface of things and to try to understand himself in the broadest, sense possible. He says the new man will be a blue man. I've thought about this for a very long time. What did he mean by a blue man? I can't tell you necessarily what he meant, but I think I know what it means to me. I was walking one day in San Francisco, and it was a nice day in the springtime, and I was thinking about Toomer, and I looked up at the sky, and it was blue. And suddenly it hit me. The depictions of Krishna are blue. Why is Krishna, because he's in human form, just, 2 arms, 2 legs, head, but why is he blue? Well, I understood what they were doing. His skin is blue to indicate that, like the sky, he is boundless, right? He has no edges. He is infinite. So the new man, the blue man, will be someone who shatters all of these categories and labels and boxes into which we put other people and ourselves. The new man, blue man, I suppose for Toomer is a liberated, awakened human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And blue, of course, is not the color that we normally use when we describe ethnicities, black, white, yellow, brown.
No.
And now we're talking about blue, it's a new color and a new man who is free from those usual colorations of race that we normally use. And again, along these same lines of the kind of liberating and freeing effect, a new person, you have written very interestingly, or you have said very, very interestingly, and here again, I quote you, were it not for the Buddha Dharma, I'm convinced that as a Black American and artist, I would not have been able to successfully negotiate my last half century of life in this country. And you've also said the Buddha Dharma offers freedom no other religion does, freedom even from itself, from the doctrines of the Buddha Dharma. Could you elaborate on this?
Yes, I could talk a long time about this. I do feel that ever since I was in my teens and first meditated at the age of 14, and then spent the rest of my teens and 20s studying academically Buddhism, I've always felt that it is a refuge. For me, it was a refuge from all kinds of destructive things in Western society, and particularly in American society, because it showed me a different way of seeing the world. One of my favorite metaphors, and I return to it often, is imagine you're living as a fish in a fishbowl. You're swimming around in the fishbowl, and this is all that you know, the bottom of the fishbowl, the sides of the fishbowl, top of the fishbowl. That's your conditioning. That is conditioning that you have received from your particular culture. A lot of it's accidental. Some of it's come from parents, some of it's come from the culture, some of it's come from teachers, but you're in a fishbowl. Now imagine somebody reaching into that fishbowl, grabbing the fish, lifting him out, and dropping him into the ocean. And suddenly that fish is going to realize, oh my goodness, there is a vastness out here that I never dreamed possible. Now that metaphor is actually rather similar, now that I think about it, to Plato's myth of the cave, where the people are in the cave seeing shadows and thinking that they're real. And as one person suddenly goes out of the cave and sees real people and goes back and tells the other, you're looking at shadows. And they laugh at it. They think he's crazy. The beauty of the Buddha Dharma for me is that it helped me transcend concepts that were questionable and opened me up to other cultural ways of approaching the world, other ontologies even, ways of being. So yeah, I've always felt very privileged and grateful that I was able to discover Buddhism very early, in my life. Now you had a second question. That was very important, which is why is Buddhism the only religion, at least that I know of, that wants to free you from itself? One of the important things, there's several important things about Buddha Dharma, but one of the important things is not clinging, to free yourself from attachments, to really be free. So in Buddhist practice, the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, all of these are tools. They are tools to help us with our progress towards liberation. The classic metaphor for this is you get in a boat to go across the water, right? And you could say the water is the sea of suffering, if you like. When you get to the shore, you don't carry the boat around on your back. You don't need it on land. You let it go. So the whole purpose of Buddhist practice is these are tools. At some point, we will go beyond them, probably because we have internalized them so much. It becomes impossible for you to lie, to steal, to kill. I mean, you just can't do, you can't do that anymore. So the tool, has served its purpose. The Buddha there's a wonderful story about the Buddha. One of my favorite formulations in Buddhism is anicca, dukkha, anatta. Anicca that's Pali. Anicca means everything is impermanent. Everything is impermanent. Everything dies. Even this universe in which we find ourselves will someday no longer be anicca, impermanence. The second part of that formulation, dukkha, that causes suffering. If you cling to something that is going to go away, that is going to die, that's going to cause suffering. And the final part of that, anicca, dukkha, anatta is no self. There is no self. That is to say, there is, you know why there's no self? It's because we are not nouns, we are verbs. We are not products, we are processes. We are constantly in motion and changing all the time. There's nothing essential about any one of us. There is no blackness, there is no whiteness, there is no, none of those essentialistic things. So the story the Buddha tells is, I've been teaching you disciples the doctrine of no self, that there is no self. But if you cling to that, the Buddha said, I'm going to teach a doctrine of self just to wake you up. The whole point is for you to be free. The thrust of Buddhism is to liberate you.
So much of growing up, I guess it's fairly common for most people. Certainly, it was true for me growing up, and by that I mean by the time we reach college, high school, or college age, that time in our lives, we wonder about our identity, and especially if you're coming, as we all do, from some kind of an ethnic group, what does it mean to be Japanese? What does it mean to be African American? What does it mean to be this or that? And we search for our identity. And for me, one of the really kind of liberating things about studying Buddhism or understanding Buddhism is that came to the realization along the lines or because of this teaching of no self, that there's no fixed me, And it was so liberating to realize that there's no fixed identity either. I didn't have to find out who, as if it's some kind of a gold nugget in there, that defines me, that I'm defined by causes and conditions that change every day from moment to moment.
That's right.
It truly is liberating. I mean, it's to be liberated from self and identity. And again, this goes back to our discussion about race and the limiting and constricting way in which that idea can work on us. So yeah, it's a powerful message and a very personal one too.
Absolutely. Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to sort of grab onto the tail end of what you were saying. We have to acknowledge differences, that have happened. We all don't have the same story. We all don't have the same story. So we have to acknowledge differences in people and what they have experienced and be sensitive to that. Now, in Buddhism, it's called the theory of two truths. One truth that we have to acknowledge is conventional reality. Conventional reality, right? And in conventional reality, I have to acknowledge that there was slavery that affected my ancestors. I have to acknowledge that there was 70, 80 years of segregation that caused a great deal of harm and maimed a lot of people, Black people. And that there was the Japanese internment camps in America. These are not things to be ignored. These are things that are part of a person's past. But I like the phrasing that one Buddhist teacher came up with. He says, I am not blind. I am not blind to those things, but neither am I bound by them. Right? I am not blind to the individual suffering that happens on the conventional level of reality, but I am not bound by that. And then there is an absolute level of truth too, which is very difficult to talk about because it transcends language. Because language, the structure of a sentence very often can plunge you into dualistic thinking and even essentialistic thinking. Right. So on the absolute level, as Thich Nhat Hanh has often said, this is not discursive thought. This is not what you experience there. But I agree with you.
Now, we've been looking at this and talking about this in the context of Buddhism, but I'd like to slide a little bit over into Martin Luther King and his Christianity and his way of looking at it through a very different religious lens. But you often write that Martin Luther King's ideal of the, quote, beloved community is a Sangha, meaning a Buddhist community, by another name. So what do you mean by this in terms of equating Martin Luther King's sort of, Christian, if I can put a label onto it, beloved community, and the Sangha, which is the label for the Buddhist community? What did you mean by equating them?
Well, that's a title of the very first article I wrote on Buddhism for Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. I spent a lot of my time working on King. I spent a fifth of my life studying King, writing about King, a novel called Dreamer, a short story called Dr. King's Refrigerator, lots of essays on King. On his birthday, I would give lots of talks around the country, on Martin Luther King Day. And I was born, not a Buddhist, but a cradle Christian. So I kind of understand, quote unquote, where he's coming from with his orientation. And I'm respectful of it. I'm respectful of all religions, the positive aspects, of all religions. Now, when I say a Sangha by another name, what are the three jewels in Buddhism? The Tri Ratnam, right? Three jewels, Tri Ratnam jewels. They are the Buddha, right? The teacher. They are the Dharma, the teachings. And then there is the Sangha, right? Which is the community of people who are following the teachings and helping each other on a spiritual path. Now, the Sangha literally begins, when it begins, it means
the community of monks and nuns, right? Buddhist monks and nuns. But many people have expanded upon that idea of the Sangha to include all sentient beings. Thich Nhat Hanh speaks of, the Sangha that way. So a Sangha by another name is what I think King was wanting us to achieve. Now that phrase, beloved community, has been picked up by a lot of people. I see it in a lot of places now. King popularized it, but he did not conceive the phrase. He took that from another theologian. He didn't generate it himself, but he popularized it. So yeah, I think it's appropriate to talk about all of those of us who are pursuing a spiritual path, to be part of a global Sangha, if you like. And finally, the Bodhisattva ideal is to work towards the happiness and freedom from suffering of all sentient beings. So for Thich Nhat Hanh, all sentient beings constitute our Sangha. That's just not humans. That's animals. That's plants. That's the planet, if you like, itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned just a short while ago the two truths, the lower and the higher truth. The lower truth is the truth of ordinary reality as we find it. The reality of slavery, of internment, of injustice, of violence, and so on and so on. And then there's the higher truth, which attempts to try to liberate us from all of the ordinary kinds of suffering that we have to endure. And it's a very complex relationship, even within Buddhism, but certainly within our ordinary lives as well. The struggle between our higher ideals and the actual situations and circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I'm really curious about what Buddhism has to say, particularly about the lower truth, about how we can deal with the lower truth. And in your and you describe the eightfold path, which I would class as the higher truth, as the actually you describe it as samsaric means, that is to say, the ordinary life means, to nirvanic ends, to the ideal ends. And Buddhism has certainly a long tradition of social engagement. Nevertheless, it seems to me, and a lot of people have criticized Buddhism for this, that there is a lack of a real robust Buddhist political philosophy. That is, a philosophy on the side of the lower truth that can match Christian developments of, say, the social gospel or liberation theology. And clearly, Buddhism has a prescription for individual liberation. But what is the strategy for social salvation?
Okay, that's a question. It comes up all the time. I guess I've heard it since I was very young. It's very much an American question directed at people who are practicing Buddhists. There's a lot to say about this, but again, I think in a way it's asking the wrong question. It's asking a political question of something that is a religion, a philosophy, and a spiritual practice, right? And if you ask the question from the political realm, you're asking it from the standpoint of dualism, probably. And that is not something that most Buddhists want to find themselves plunging into, listen, we have divisiveness and division in America today like I have not seen since the 60s. And as someone pointed out to me recently, not almost since the Civil War have we seen this kind of divisiveness of us against them. And I think that is causing a great deal of suffering. Now, if somebody wants to, there's so much you could say about this. You could look at King Ashoka and his kingdom and the edicts that he came up with after he became a Buddhist, and you will see a plan
at least in Asoka's edicts, for how we should do things, how we should treat prisoners, right? How we should try to help them reintegrate into society and get over whatever it was that caused them to go to prison. Look at Ashoka's edicts. But then, even more importantly, I would ask people to look at the principles of engaged Buddhism conceived by Thich Nhat Hanh. All your answers are there in terms of how does Buddhism interact with the world of politics and, and with society. Those answers that he gives are extremely nuanced. He has thought through this since he was a young monk in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War. So it's not a question I think we need to worry about. You just need to continue with your practice, which during the course of the day is about reducing suffering for all sentient beings and hopefully doing what you can to bring happiness to them within 24 hours that you've got, every day. You can take a political position if you wish to, and choose. And a cause, there are causes that I definitely feel passionate about because I think they will lead to more good than evil. One of those is academic freedom. So yeah, Buddhists can participate, vote, for initiatives and things that they think will cause less suffering and greater happiness, right? For sentient beings.
Sure. Yeah, the challenge is to somehow not separate the two, the political and the spiritual, and that the spiritual hopefully will have something to say in a real way, not just theoretically, but in a real way about the political, so that there can be something that might be called Buddhist political philosophy, and not separate the two. Yeah,
and we have to be careful about labels.
Yeah,
Buddhist political philosophy.
Sure.
Because in Buddhism, since we are not dualistic, right?
Right.
There is no difference between the sacred and the profane.
Yeah.
There is no difference. So when you act every day in a way that embodies compassion and metta, loving kindness, you are affecting the social world, and that is the political world at the same time.
Yeah. Let me take something from your novel, Oxherding Tale. And it comes at the sort of the climax, at least for me, it was when the Andrew Hawkins, your runaway slave, is being tracked down by a bounty hunter, and Andrew has been on this runaway journey with a friend, coffin maker named Red, and the bounty hunter catches up with Andrew, and Andrew asks him, "What about Reb? Did you catch Red?" And the bounty hunter explains, and I'm reading here from your novel. In order to catch him, I have to feel what he feels, want what he wants. And what did he want? Nothing. That's it right there. What threw me off? Why it took so long to run him down. Your friend didn't want nothing. How the hell are you going to catch a Negro like that? He can't be caught. He's already free. But then you say, Charles, not legally, but you know what I'm saying. And so if he's spiritually free, but not legally free, then doesn't he still have a problem with the living of life in society?
Well, that's exactly why Reb and Andrew Hawkins are on the run. Okay, they are running away from slavery at the plantation of Flo Hatfield. And they had no choice. They were going to be sent to the mines. To be sent to the mines to work there is to die.
Yeah.
So they are runaway slaves.
Yeah.
That's the essence of that.
Yeah. But it seems to me that you're kind of, again, splitting, speaking of dualism, the spiritual liberation, which he has because he wants nothing, very good Buddhist lesson to learn in terms of liberation. But on the other side, he's still, legally a slave. I mean, he's still bound, so he's free spiritually, but socially, politically, he's not free. And that passage reminded me of something that Muhammad Ali once said about, again, this kind of division of spiritual over legal or political freedom. And, he said that Elijah Muhammad teaches us that Jesus said, the truth shall make you free. And the next part of what Ali said was really striking to me. Jesus didn't say, Abraham Lincoln will make you free. Jesus didn't say, Congress is going to make you free. Jesus didn't say integration and open housing will make you free. Jesus didn't say intermarriage with white folks will make you free. Jesus said the truth will make you free. And Black people today are not free because they don't know the truth. So it seems to me it's a kind of an argument similar to, what your protagonist or what's happening in the Ox-Herding Tale. And that is that, yeah, spiritually you can be free, but that's a different kind of freedom from what Congress and Abraham Lincoln and, political laws and policies will make you free. So it's a totally understandable in terms of, feeling this liberation within your bondage, but you're still in bondage.
Okay, let me address a couple of things with that. That's a great quote by Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
I had not seen that before.
Yeah.
And you said, you're quoting, Jesus said the truth will make you free, and Black people are not free today because they don't know the truth. The next line, which you didn't read, is, and Elijah Muhammad is the onlyest man with that truth. Okay, so Ali joined the Nation of Islam. And he was, and the Nation of Islam at that time was racially separatist, right? But Ali felt that the Nation of Islam had the truth, right? I don't necessarily, I'm not going to judge that, but that's not what I think is true. I'm an integrationist, okay, not a racial separatist. Let me back up to something else you said about the difference between legal freedom and spiritual freedom. In my novel Ox-Herding Tale, Reb, he makes it to a free state.
Mm-hmm.
He can get out of the South, and he could go to Boston. He could go to a place where he is a free man.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you deal with it. If you're enslaved over there, then you go over there where you won't be enslaved. You can go like this guy, I think his name was William Box Williams or something. I know his nickname was Box because he was a slave who mailed himself in a box from the South to a free state.
Yeah.
You act on, you it's simple. If you're not free, then you have to take the actions that will make you free, right?
Right. So it would seem that in Reb's case, he is free purely because of social political circumstances that has nothing to do with any kind of spiritual freedom. Is that how you see Reb?
Well, not really. When I was doing that novel, I spent 5 years on that novel because I really had to grapple with Buddhism. I personally felt I had to grapple with the 10 ox-herding pictures. I also personally felt I needed to answer Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, right? I mean, that was going to be my Buddhist novel where I got all the Buddhism out of my system. But then when I got to the end of the book, I realized, no, I just scratched the surface of my passion, about Buddhism. Now, if you look at Reb, I had conceived him of kind of like the resident, not Buddhist, but Taoist on this plantation. But there's enough Buddhist elements in him to be important. But I want to clarify one thing. You said Red doesn't feel, he has no desire. People misunderstand this about Buddhism. This is the Four Noble Truths. The first Noble Truth says there is suffering. Okay? I think we can all agree on that. The second Noble Truth says the cause of suffering is Trishna. Trishna in Pali. That means, Trishna means thirst. Thirst. And thirst means craving. Okay? That's the cause for the Buddha of suffering. The third Noble Truth says there's liberation from suffering. And the fourth Noble Truth says that liberation can be found in the Eightfold Path. But when we say that the cause of truth is desire, suffering is desire, what we mean is selfish desire. Selfish desire. Desire is just energy, right? You're going to have to desire. Hey, you got to desire awakening if you're going to get on a spiritual path. You have to desire something in this life. But that doesn't mean selfish desire, nor does it mean being attached to it, to selfish desire or clinging, right? So that's a distinction I think it's very important to make, because people think Buddhists have no feelings. That's not true. If you practice mindfulness meditation, you realize moment by moment in your consciousness, there is a panorama of feelings of all kinds and thoughts and memories and projections into the future. It's called the stream of consciousness, right? And that's what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is the study of consciousness. It's the study of consciousness. The earliest, most basic kind of Buddhism, 2,600 years ago, has great similarity to the Western philosophy, the method called phenomenology. I see the early Buddhism as being a kind of proto-phenomenology. It is asking questions about what is consciousness? What is the self? What is perception, right? So, this it is a philosophy of consciousness and a philosophy of desire. And the answers that it provides, I think, are very compelling.
Okay. The third Noble Truth, the cessation of desire. Does that include all desire or just, bad as opposed to good desires?
Well, it's certainly in our practice, it means constantly checking ourselves against selfish desire, or desires that will cause harm to others.
Is altruistic desire acceptable? Altruistic?
Yes,
desire?
it is. Yes, it is. No, yes, it is. Altruistic desire is acceptable. Let me put it this way, and there's four ways you can look at this in terms of consciousness. One is if you are conscious of empathy and compassion toward other sentient beings, that thought, that feeling goes through your consciousness, that you want to cultivate, that you want to see arise again in your consciousness, right? If there is potential empathy and compassion that hasn't come into being, that you want to nurture. Similarly, if you have feelings of greed, hatred, jealousy, those that exist right now, those you want to let go. You can watch them pass through your consciousness and let them go, because even thought is impermanent. The beauty of Buddhism is it makes it clear even thoughts rise, crest, and pass away. Similarly, if there is potential evil that can come into existence, that you want to not nurture. You don't want to feed that bad wolf. You don't want to feed that at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I can see that, but there are also some interpretations of the third noble truth, that the cessation of desire refers to all desire. And so even altruistic desire, it's better than bad desire, but it will still lead to the first truth, which is suffering. And I think that's probably true that even in our altruism, we're not freed from suffering, because all desire, leads to suffering. We're running out of time, and I have a whole bunch of other questions that I'd love to get to. I wanted to ask you about, what do you think about the state of Buddhist fiction today? I wanted to ask you, this is probably the question that most of our listeners would be interested in, and that is what you had to say about Buddhism and sex. That relates to desire. But we are running out of time, and I want to ask you a question that I think is probably uppermost or most important in your life at this point, and that is that you're a grandfather. And you recently published a book called Grand, in which you share stories with your grandson, and the subtitle has to do with a grandparent's wisdom for his happy life. So in the 3 minutes that we have left, what is your grandparent's wisdom for your grandson's happy life?
Whoa. In that book, which came out last year, Grand, a grandparent's wisdom for a happy life, I present 10 ideas that I would like for my grandson, but all the kids of his generation and adults as well. It's not just for kids to consider what these points are that I'm making, because I think that they transcend generation. And the very first one is know thyself. That is, and that's the old ancient, Athenian ideal as well. I think he needs to constantly ask that question. To know himself in his teens. It's not going to be the same thing as to know himself when he's 30. It's not going to be the same as to know himself when he's 40 and a father himself, right? Or to know himself when he's 70 and has entered into that season of life. It's a constant question we have to constantly ask, because we're constantly changing, right? And then there are other chapters. One is called Tavam Asi. That's a Sanskrit phrase, which means you are that. You are that. Tat Tavam Asi. What does that mean? It means that if we investigate anything around us deeply enough, we are going to see ourselves. We're going to see ourselves in it. Whether object or others, it might be Tat Tavam Asi. You are that. Some of the other passages that in the last one, the chapter is called To Love is to Live. Because ultimately, in my personal experience, there is no greater experience than love. It brings about all the virtues that we want to talk about. Unselfishness, thinking about the other before yourself.
Sure.
Sure.
I'm sorry we're running out of time, but that's a great place to stop on that point that you just made. And I really want to thank you, Charles, especially since you're doing this at such an ungodly hour on the East Coast. It's past midnight already. It's past your bedtime, Charles. But your work means a great deal to many people, and we look forward to reading more of your writings. And I want to thank you again, Charles, for discussing Buddhism, writing, and race.